Em 5 segundos, mais uma transmissão de conhecimento do Centro Universitário Internacional Uninter.
Boa noite, agradeço a presença e a participação de todos e todas, sejam muito bem-vindos ao Global Meeting. Nessa noite muito especial, nós teremos a mesa Liderança Indígena e Relacionidade além das fronteiras. Antes de iniciarmos, é importante agradecermos a todos que estão nos assistindo, que estão dispostos a debater conosco esse tema que é tão importante. Agradeço também a todos os colegas da Uninter que fizeram esse evento possível, nosso reitor, os diretores das escolas, a equipe dos estúdios, marketing e todos os professores envolvidos. Antes de iniciarmos as discussões acadêmicas da noite, nós gostaríamos de abrir a palavra para Jason Dyer, vice-presidente do Global. Seja muito bem-vindo, Jason. Nós gostaríamos de ouvir de você nesse momento.
Olá, boa noite a todas e todos. É uma honra estar aqui com vocês. Eu acho que meu histórico com este grupo, especialmente com a professora Karine e o professor Tim, que estão conosco, eu tive o prazer e a honra, né, de trabalhar com essas pessoas excelentes e do bem, para tornar um curso colaborativo em campo realidade em 2023 e 2024, o que a gente chama de Collaborative Field Experience. E esses programas juntaram diretamente por volta de 50 estudantes e professores, né, tanto da Uninter quanto da nossa instituição parceira no Canadá, e vindo de lugares bem distantes e culturas e lutas e valores surpreendentemente semelhantes. Eu não conhecia, mas esses povos se conhecem muito bem, apesar de não terem tido contato anterior. E esses cursos envolveram centenas de pessoas em Curitiba e ao redor do mundo que mostraram uma generosidade de espírito e uma paciência realmente notáveis. Então, o trabalho começou bem antes de 2023, né, quando a professora Dina Mara fez o primeiro contato com a First Nations University of Canada, e a iniciativa foi possível graças a inúmeras pessoas, né? Entre elas a professora Bettina, da Universidade First Nations, o professor Tim, que esteve na liderança no segundo ano, que está conosco hoje. E mesmo com os desafios da distância, de recursos, que é sempre um desafio, e de agendas lotadas, a colaboração continua dando frutos. Com este evento de hoje, a possível ida de uma estudante da Uninter que participou de um desses programas para a Regina, antes do final de 2025, com a vinda de um professor da Universidade da Regina, que fica do lado da First Nations, na cidade de Regina, no Canadá, no início de 2026. Então, o que ao longo desse tempo de colaboração mais me marcou é o progresso nesses últimos 3 anos e o protagonismo crescente das lideranças indígenas, né, que se tornou possível, pelo menos dentro da Uninter, em boa parte graças à visão, né, da professora Dina Mara, do reitor e dos diretores da Uninter. Então, essa busca e a contratação de uma pessoa muito especial, acho que para a instituição, com certeza para mim, a professora Karina, da Escola Superior de Educação, dá raízes muito mais fortes, naturais e extensas entre os povos originários do Brasil e de Canadá. Então, ela é uma joia como líder da sua comunidade, como ponte, né, entre povos originários no Brasil e como ponte para unir dentro e bem além do Brasil. Então, eu simplesmente quero agradecer a oportunidade de estar com vocês hoje neste evento. Espero que esta colaboração ajude a trazer mais luz e atenção aos enormes desafios e problemas que temos em termos de sustentabilidade. Gostaria de adicionar minhas boas-vindas ao professor Tim e um abraço para a professora Karina. Sei que estamos em ótimas mãos com vocês e volto ao protagonismo que vocês merecem e têm neste evento. Obrigado.
deserve.
Nós que
Thank you.
agradecemos, Jason. Obrigada pelas palavras.
Thank you,
Hoje
Jason,
nós
for your
temos uma
kind
presença
words. And today
especial do
we have
professor
the
Rogério
special
Pereira Cunha.
presence
Antes
of
de passarmos a
Professor
palavra para o professor
Rogério
Rogério,
Cunha.
farei
And
breve histórico
before
da
Professor
apresentação do
Rogério,
professor.
we
O
have a
professor
history
Rogério
of the
possui
professor.
habilidades
He is
com mestrado e doutorado em
historian and
acadêmica e história
philosopher.
do
He
Brasil.
has
Ele
a
atuou como professor
PhD
de educação
ongoing.
básica
He
e de
worked
ensino
as
superior no setor de
basic
línguas e
professor in
sociedade no
the
Brasil.
language
É
and
autor e revisor
society
técnico de livros
here.
didáticos
And
e
he
especialista em avaliação e
he's also
educação.
expert
Professor
in
Rogério, seja
educational
bem-vindo. A palavra
evaluation.
é para o
Welcome,
senhor.
Professor Rogério. The floor is yours.
Boa noite a todos e todas.
Good
Quero
evening,
desde já
everyone.
registrar
What a
nossa
great
gratidão
joy to be part
especial.
of this so
Ela é muito
special
feliz
night.
receber
It's
mais
a
uma
joy
edição do
to
Global
welcome
Meeting
you in
Uninter.
another
Muito especial
edition
esse
of a
momento
Global
da
Meeting.
nossa
This is a
convivência
special
com a
moment
organização
celebrating
cidadã,
our
com diálogo
commitment
intercultural
with
que debate
intercultural
tópicos
dialogue that goes
conectados para
beyond
grupos, pessoas
borders,
diversas ao redor do
connecting
mundo. É
people
importante
throughout the world.
agradecermos, né, dar
It's
aqui os nossos
important to
mais sinceros
thank
agradecimentos ao professor
everyone,
reitor, né, ao professor Comunidades,
our
aos
dean,
pró-reitores,
and the
aos diretores das
pro-deans, the
ODS Uninter,
directors
aos
of Uninter
colaboradores aqui que
schools,
contribuem
dear
com a
Jason
forma,
and
muito
vice
colaboram,
president and
cuja dedicação foi
co-founder.
fundamental para que esse
Their
momento
dedication was
acontecesse. Muito
paramount to
obrigado a
make
todos
this
vocês.
moment
Nessa
happen.
ocasião, eu tenho a honra
Thank
de
you,
apresentar a
Jason.
professora
I have the
Cristiane
honor to
Domingues, que é
introduce
coordenadora
Professor
da
Chris Domingues.
Cidades
She is
e
the
coordenadora
coordinator of Language and
do
Society,
Acadêmico de
and
Informatização.
Mr.
Ambos gostariam de estar
Paura.
aqui, mas
Both would
acompanharão
like
o
to
nosso
be
estudo.
here, but
Mas,
they
em nome
couldn't
deles,
this
eu
night.
compartilho um
But on
grande
their behalf, I
privilégio de todo o
share a
grupo de
great
docentes em
pride that our
contribuir com a
team
realização
feels
do
to
evento tão
contribute
relevante para a
to
nossa
carry out a
universidade.
so relevant
Reafirmando o
event for
papel da
our
educação, tanto
academic
institucional
area,
como humano, não
restating
institucionais, mas sólidos,
institutional and
transformadores
human
e
links, which
transformadores.
are more
O tema
solid
que
and
vimos nessa
transforming.
tarde
The
busca
topic that
reconhecer e
brings us
aprender com os
together
destinos que
help
existem
us
enraizados
understand
nas
how
ancestrais
leadership from our
práticas de
ancestors
verdade, em
and
outras
the care
palavras, sabe, de
practices and other
desenvolvimento,
way
nós
of
vamos trazer
thinking
respostas
and see
aos
the
nossos
world can
desafios
bring
do
us
presente. É um
answers
convite
to
muito especial
our
hoje da escuta.
contemporary dilemmas.
Nós
So
temos que
today
ter,
we
eu tenho
must
certeza que o
listen
professor Tim e a professora
attentively. I
Karina
know
vão
Professor Tim and
proporcionar
Karina, they are
também
going
alguns
to
detalhes
provide
da
us with that.
introdução que
Thank you,
deverão ser
Professor
passadas
Tim,
aqui.
for
E
having
a professora
accepted this
Karina também,
invitation.
mas
Professor
eu mais
Karina as
gostaria
well.
desejo um
And
excelente evento para
I
todos
wish you
nós.
an amazing event to all of us.
Obrigada, professor Rogério.
Thank you,
Nosso
Professor
evento hoje
Rogério. Our
se
event
relaciona
today
ao
is
ODS
related
de
to
número 11, que
ODS number
integra a
11
Agenda
that
2030 e as
integrates
Nações
Agenda
Unidas. E foi
2030 by
formulado com o
UN. It was
propósito de tornar as
formulated with
cidades
the
desenvolvimentos
goal of
humanos inclusivos,
making the
seguros,
cities and
resilientes e sustentáveis.
inclusive,
Essa data
resilient, and
reflete a
sustainable.
urgência
This
em enfrentar os
target
desafios
reflects the
associados à
urgency to
urbanização
tackle the
acelerada,
challenges
à
regarding
desigualdade
accelerated
socioracial, à degradação
urbanism,
ambiental e à
the
exclusão de
environmental
grupos
degradation, and
vulnerabilizados no
exclusion
planejamento
of
urbano.
vulnerable
A
groups in the
elaboração da
urban
ODS
areas.
11 foi
The
marcada por um
elaboration
processo
of ODS 11
participativo
was
que
marked by a
envolveu ações de
participative
governança
process that
multinível,
involved
diálogos com as
multi-level
comunidades
governance,
locais e
dialogue with
reivindicações
local
por direitos
communities,
à
and the
cidade e à
holdout
justiça
for their
territorial.
rights
Nesse
and their
sentido, a
territory.
ODS 11
With that,
reconhece que a
ODS 11
sustentabilidade
recognizes that
urbana está
urban
acima das bases
sustainability
estruturais
surpasses the
ambientais,
structural
abrangendo
environmental
também
issues.
a diversidade
It also
cultural,
comprehends the
justiça
cultural
social e a
aspects,
participação
social
comunitária
justice,
na
and
gestão do
communitary
espaço urbano.
participation in the
O
management of
reconhecimento
urban
dos saberes
spaces, the
tradicionais, a proteção
acknowledgement
de
of
territórios
the
originários e a
traditional
valorização das
aspects, the
práticas
indigenous
socioambientais
tribes, and
indígenas
the
são elementos
social
centrais para a
environmental
construção de
elements are
comunidades
central, are key
verdadeiramente
to build
sustentáveis.
communities which
Pensando
are really
nessas dimensões,
sustainable.
teremos
Bear
um
in mind
momento
these
muito
dimensions. We are
especial
going to have a
com a
very
nossa
special
professora
evening with
convidada,
our
Margarida Costa Santos,
guest
e o
professor,
nosso
Mrs.
palestrante,
Santos,
professor
and
Tim
our
Insana, Isnana,
speaker,
desculpe.
Mr. Tim Isnana.
Antes de passarmos a
And
palavra aos
before
professores,
giving the floor to the professors, I'm going to
resumo da atuação do professor Tim.
summarize
Ele é professor de
Professor's
linguagens
Tim
indígenas e
CB. He's a
administração
professor of
pública na
Indigenous
First Nations
Business
University
and
of Canada.
Public Administration
Membro
at
permanente
First
da
Nations
Nação Buffalo
University of
Decola,
Kennedy,
possui
and a
mestrado em
member
administração
at
de empresas
Buffalo Decola.
pela
He has a
Universidade da
master
Athabasca,
in business
bacharelado em
management.
comércio pela
He has
Universidade
a
de
graduate degree.
desculpem se eu pronunciar
I'm
errado a
sorry if
palavra,
I pronounce it wrong.
Saskatchewan, e é
Saskatchewan,
ex-aluno
and
da
a former
First Nations
student at First Nations University of Canada. His research talks about corporate social responsibility regarding Indigenous people, stakeholders, Indigenous stakeholders, and natural resources such as water. And the team has been working for a long time in these areas, and he's focused on the applicable aspects for Indigenous students. It's an honor for our team to welcome you this night. You are going to have 40 minutes to make your reflections. At the end, we are going to have some time for a dialogue between you and Professor Karina.
Professor Tim, thank you for
Professor
being here with
Tim,
us. As agreed, you'll have 40 minutes for your reflections. And at the end of it, we will have a mutual participation, a dialogue between you and Professor Karina. So, Professor Tim, please welcome, and it's a pleasure to have you here with us.
Hi, thank you for having me. Hello, everyone. Greetings from First Nations University of Canada here in Regina, Saskatchewan. Thankfully for the opportunity to speak on behalf of our university and on behalf of some of the research that I've been undertaking and ongoing. Again, it's been a challenge and on this education journey to get my research to where it is and all the back end stuff, all the work that actually goes behind it. Again, thank you for inviting me to participate in tonight's event here.
Okay. Professor Tim, you can now start your reflections on the topic, right? At the end of it, we will have a moment for you and Professor Karina to talk together and discuss the topic.
Okay, so a lot of the research that has been done so far in my doctoral studies basically has been looking at, what's really out there, what are the challenges that communities and both urban and rural communities in different countries around the world have been experiencing. And a lot of the big challenges that we see through the research is it's that urban rural divide, so to speak, and the sustainable goals that have been presented for sustainable development, sustainable cities in the future. We take a look at one of the things that I mention to my students every semester is the world population is growing, and that we need to figure out ways to create opportunities for kind of that balance between our urban rural knowledge that is out there. Sustainable cities requires a lot of rethinking the process, to rethinking how we do things, and in turn, basically ensuring that this collaborative effort exists or will continue to happen now and well into the future. Sustainable cities is in some parts of the world is lagging, but in other parts is very advanced. It becomes a challenge when you have multiple stakeholders that are sitting at the table or who need to be invited to the table in order for new ideas to be discussed and developed, and as well as the potential costs associated with a lot of the ideas. That you can have a good plan, but you really need to have everybody on board in order to figure out, how does sustainable cities look like now, and how do we want to see ourselves in 25 years? Nobody can see the future, but you have to have some type of document available that can be reviewed annually for the next 25 years, and basically what worked and what hasn't worked. You're constantly making changes, right? This is the part of governance that we see in many municipalities, different levels of government all around the world. So from the research, from what I understand or from what I read, and trying to decipher, like, how does that exist from an Indigenous rural perspective. A lot of the knowledge that a lot of communities have, here in Canada, there needs to be, they too, as a stakeholder, need to be included in a lot of the tables that exist at the different levels of government, as well as the different businesses and organizations that support government agencies, government levels themselves. So in order to, how do we look at our urban planning process here in this city? How does the urban planning process exist in our West Coast or versus our East Coast or in the northern part of our country here in Canada? And it really takes a lot of communication, which is extremely critical because various parts of the country has to make certain changes to their development plans, their processes, in order to adapt to the realities of climate change. So, for example, in the East Coast, there's a lot of soil erosion due to the melting ice that is actually raising the sea levels. So a lot of our First Nation communities along the East Coast of Canada are actually dealing with soil erosion and the loss of their lands, which is particularly concerning because a lot of the land that they have in their traditional territories has very significant value to the communities within that area. A lot of their historically, a lot of their elders, relatives who have been passed on, basically are buried in a lot of those spaces. So they're working feverishly with the engineering companies to develop new types of infrastructure to minimize the soil erosion within the East Coast, which is, in order for to protect their traditional territories. When we take a look at the West Coast here in Canada, I was in Vancouver about a month and a half ago, and walking along the traditional territories of the Western Indigenous communities, which basically is right a part of Vancouver City. You can see the traditional tie-in built into the engineering infrastructure in order to help minimize the potential erosion along the shores along the West Coast. And I find it very interesting because the different mindset that they have there, where the realities of climate change, rising sea levels is impacting how the city is preparing and maintaining its boundaries along the sea lines, in order to prepare for the eventuality that the sea levels will rise to a certain level. So a lot of the engineering firms out in Western Canada are working alongside a lot of the Indigenous communities in order to really understand, how does that knowledge impact the infrastructure that they're developing right now, and really in order to maintain a sustainable city where urban development can continue to grow, but at the same time monitoring and trying to minimize the impact that it'll actually have to the land itself and the surroundings. So when you take a look at our northern coast, very far north, it's completely different as well. But it's the same issue that the Indigenous communities up there are dealing with. The rising sea levels are actually encroaching along the sea walls, I guess you would say, and then again, it's impeding the developments, but at the same time, it's also encroaching their traditional territories. Again, what we've seen in the East Coast and what we've seen in the West Coast is actually happening in the northern parts of Canada as well. So when we take a look at the ideas of sustainable cities, it's the ideas or the mindsets that everybody, all these stakeholders that have to be sitting at the table and be willing to prepare to accept change. And that change means that what was normally historically done in the past, it worked for time being, but at the same time, going 25 years into the future, they have to be prepared to accept a little bit of change in that process. So sustainable cities, when we take a look at it now, you don't have to go too far here in Canada to really realize the impact that climate change is impacting our cities. I was being in Canada here this winter, we've had almost like 4 consecutive days of -50, -50 Celsius temperature, where we've never seen that type of temperature in the prairies growing up as a kid. Normal weather for us in the prairies would be -30. So this extra cold, this deep freeze that we've experienced, and it's becoming more frequent and much longer here in Saskatchewan, that it really begins to hit home. Like, what do we have to do in the city where First Nations University is located? What do we have to do in order to protect the infrastructure from the varying degrees of temperature? So we were -50 this winter, and we're going to be +40, probably +45 humidity this summer. So you can see that varying temperatures is quite significant in, here in central part of Canada. Sustainable cities has to take into account that this type of weather phenomena did not exist 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So, the way I see it right now is that we have to start looking at getting all the stakeholders to the table in order to collaboratively work together for us to understand, what are we facing and what are we up against? The sheer amount of money that the municipality here has to put towards snow removal every year is growing each year. Our snowfall levels this year was, above records again, and it literally caused us almost a complete standstill in this entire city. So, we have a smaller city here, but if there's nothing moving, the economy slows and we're stuck until we can dig ourselves out. Come springtime, we're now experiencing extreme dry, and we've been under a fire ban for the past 3.5 weeks, where the grasses on the outside of the city have been so dry that they've been caused by just natural phenomena such as lightning strikes and some human, but it has impacted the city because we have northwest winds, and those dry grasses where the fires are started will encroach near city boundaries. So that has a huge implication in terms of air quality, especially for a smaller city like this. But we also have the larger impeding forests that are in northern part of Canada, northern part of Saskatchewan, that they're already preparing to invest more money into emergency management services to prepare for the upcoming forest fire season, which basically will encroach a lot of cities. We've seen that in Alberta. Part of the town of Jasper, Alberta, was burnt. Half of the town was lost due to a wildfire. Other parts of Alberta were evacuated. Other parts, smaller towns, were basically destroyed due to wildfires. So sustainable cities in Canada basically requires everybody to be on guard. Where here in Canada, they just released a new emergency management system, alert system via cell phone, where if it's weather related, which is quite frequent here in Canada now, so whether it be forest fires, extreme cold warnings, or extreme heat warnings and stuff like that, we're actually preparing, Canada as a whole is preparing for a lot of this in order to help people in all the cities across the country to prepare for the potential of what's actually going to happen. So, sustainable cities has to be prepared. It has to be ready to develop new ideas, and these new ideas are basically what we're here to talk about. So I'm very glad to share a lot of this.
Professor Tim, you're on mute. I would like to ask if you have finished your reflections on the topic.
Sorry about that, actually. I had the cough, so yes, I am finished. Thank you.
All right. Professor Tim, thank you very much for your reflections. They were very enlightening. We will now start a conversation between you and Professor Karina. Nós vamos ter agora, então, um momento, né, de diálogo entre o
We
professor Tim e a
have a
professora
dialogue
Karina.
moment
Mas
between
antes
Professor
disso, eu
Tim and
gostaria de
Karina.
introduzir a
And
professora Karina,
before
apresentá-la
that,
para
I'd
a
like
nossa
to
audiência.
introduce
A
her
professora
to
Karina é
the audience, Professor
especialista em ensino
Karina,
de língua
expert
portuguesa
in
pela
Portuguese language
faculdade da
teaching
IRI,
by
dedicando
Cidades
Amazonas, graduada em
University
letras
from
pela
Amazonas. She has
Universidade
a
do
degree
Estado do
in,
Amazonas
in
em
letters.
2017 e
She
ingressou como professora
In
cumulativa na
2017,
Secretaria do
she
Estado
became as
de
a full
Educação do
professor
Amazonas, onde
in
trabalhou no ensino
the
fundamental
State
e médio,
Secretariat of
atuando como
Education,
professora e
working
coordenando
as a professor
projetos
coordinating
insólitos
projects.
e saídas, histórias incríveis que nos fazem
And she
refletir
has
através do
incredible
estranho, do maravilhoso
histories
e do
that makes
fantástico.
us
E
think
apenas, eu também sou índio, em
about it.
cumprimento à lei
And then
11.648
complying the
de
law
2008.
11
Em 2015, teve
64 in
experiência como
2008.
professora de
2015
ensino
had
superior da
experience
Escola
as a
Normal
higher
Superior
education
da
professor
Universidade do
at
Estado do Amazonas.
uh,
Recentemente,
Amazonas
defendeu sua
University.
dissertação de
Recently, she
mestrado em estudos
defended
linguísticos
her
na
master's
Universidade
and
Federal
in
da Fronteira Sul,
linguistic
campus
studies
Chapecó.
at
Como
Campus
mestranda,
Chapecó.
atuou como
As a
voluntária no
master's
Centro de
student,
Línguas da
she
Universidade da
worked as a
Fronteira Sul,
volunteer
com
at
português
the
para
south
estrangeiros
border
voltado ao
for
público
foreign
venezuelano e
teaching
africano,
Portuguese for
conforme as
foreigners
avaliações do
from
CEP-2,
Venezuela. Uh,
estendendo
and
sua
she
atuação como
extended
orientadora do staff
her
BRAS no posto
actions
da
as staff
UFFS.
brass at
Tem experiência no
UFS.
ensino de língua
She has
portuguesa com
experience
ênfase em
in teaching
linguística, é
Portuguese,
membro do grupo de
focusing
pesquisa
in
Sociolinguismo e
linguistics and
Interfaces da
social linguisms
UFFS.
and
Dentro da
interfaces of
linguística, desenvolve
UFSS.
pesquisa
In
voltada ao
linguistics, she
português
develops
indígena,
research,
identidade
a
e
focus
comunicação.
on
É
Brazilian
membro do
and
Grupo
Indigenous
Nacional de Estudos do
Portuguese. She's a
Português
member
Indígena,
of
apoiado pela
Indigenous
Unesco
Portuguese,
em
supported
razão
by
da década
UNESCO,
internacional das línguas
for
indígenas.
the
É uma das
indigenous language.
organizadoras
She
do
is one of the
Collaborative Field Experience de
organizers of the
2024,
collaborative
que
field
reuniu
experience
estudantes
in
indígenas, canadenses e
2024, bringing
brasileiros
together
e não
Canadian people,
indígenas
students,
brasileiros num curso
indigenous,
de imersão
non-indigenous
cultural.
Brazilian people in a
Atualmente, é
cultural
professora
course.
de ensino à
She is
distância no Centro
currently
Universitário Brasileiro, no Centro
online
Universitário
course at
Internacional Uninter, onde também
Uninter,
ministra a
where
disciplina
she
Relações
delivers
Étnico-Raciais em
classes
Fala
about
Afro-Brasileira e
ethical
Indígena.
topics,
Também faz parte da linha de
Afro-Brazilian and
pesquisa
Indigenous
Estudos
topics.
Multidisciplinares
She
em
studies
Relações Étnico-Raciais.
multidisciplinarily
Professora Karina,
on
seja muito
ethics.
bem-vinda
Welcome,
e eu
Professor
passo a palavra
Karina.
agora para esse
And
momento de
now the
troca
floor
com o
is
professor
yours.
Tim.
You can talk to Professor Tim.
Professora Karina, seu microfone está no mudo.
Professor Karina, you are on mute.
Obrigada, professora Michele.
Thank you,
É uma
Professor
satisfação
Michelle.
muito
It's a
grande
great
estar aqui a convite
satisfaction to
também do
be
professor
here
Rogério. Uma
and being
satisfação
invited by
ver desde meus
Professor
amigos
Rogério. It's
Tim,
great
Miss
to see
Nana e
Tim, Miss
Jason
Anna,
Reader.
and Jason.
E esse momento
And
aqui
this moment
é um
here
momento de
is a
troca
moment
mesmo
to
com o
exchange
Tim,
ideas
porque
with
ainda há pouco,
Tim
Tim, você falava
because,
a
Tim, you
respeito
were
dessa
talking
cidade
about these
sustentável, né?
sustainable
E
cities.
que nós
And
temos aqui uma
here
palavra criada
we
por um
have a
filósofo
word
indígena,
created by an
Ailton
indigenous
Krenak, que ele diz
philosopher,
que a
Ayrton Krenak.
solução
He
do
says that
mundo,
the solution for the
do
world,
futuro do mundo,
the future of
está
the
em
world,
duas palavras da
lies
perspectiva
in two
indígena, que é
words under the indigenous
a
perspective.
florestania,
It's
que é a
foresting,
floresta como ser
it's the
cidadão,
forest
com
as a
direitos de
citizen
cidadania,
with
e uma
rights of
cidade
citizenship,
onde tem que haver esse
and
equilíbrio entre
where
floresta
we
e
must have
cidade.
a
Exatamente
balance
isso que eu vi
between
na sua
forest
fala.
and city. This is what
E
I
que
heard from
dentro
you.
desses
And
sujeitos de direitos que são
reminding
a
of
natureza,
these
eu
rights that we
faço
have,
a
which is
tua pesquisa
nature, going to
que você está
your
desenvolvendo, né?
research that you
E
were
que você
developing, that that
você estava
is
comentando
ongoing.
anteriormente
You were
a respeito
mentioning
de como a
before, you were
comunidade
talking
indígena
about
ela vai
how the
começando a
indigenous
preservar
community
esses recursos
starts to preserve
naturais,
these
e em
natural
especial os
resources,
cursos hídricos,
especially
e como é que
the
acontece
water,
essa gestão
and how
sustentável da
does
água
these
nas
sustainable
comunidades
management
aí indígenas
happen
do
in
Canadá,
the indigenous
né?
community
E
in
dentro desse
Canada.
processo, qual é o
And within
desafio
this process, what is
mais
the
enfrentado por essas
biggest
comunidades?
challenges tackled by these communities, Tim?
Thank you. So yeah, a lot of our challenges of a lot of our Indigenous communities we've been facing here in Canada is, unfortunately, a lot of our knowledge has been discounted by a lot of the scientific community. But when it really comes forward to the engineers or individuals from from the natural sciences who take a look at Indigenous communities and the knowledge that we're trying to share in order for that change to move forward. A lot of our knowledge has basically been historically, passed on generation to generation, and really what it comes down to is a lot of it is land-based learning. And land-based learning, from my perspective, is basically spending time out into in the forest or on the land to see how the animals and all the plants and how the ecosystem actually works. And that's the traditional ecological knowledge that Indigenous people bring to the table. Many take a look at many Indigenous communities, and a lot of the Indigenous communities are situated in the rural areas in various countries. And those communities are in areas where they still practice their traditional hunting and gathering forms of sustainability. And when you bring that knowledge to the table, the first and foremost aspect that is being brought forward is that idea that we only take what we need, and we can only harvest what we need at that moment in time, so that everybody, including everything within that ecosystem, is basically still maintains its balance. So from the Indigenous perspective, we through the research that I've been reviewing, is that Indigenous peoples around the world are stewards of the land, and it's their traditional ecological knowledge that they're bringing to the table, which makes a huge impact for First Nation communities here in Canada. So when we take a look at the resource, specifically water, and how you manage that resource, you don't have to go too far. So here in Canada, we have an animal called a beaver. And that beaver basically will take the surroundings, the natural building materials, in order to dam up pools of water. And those pools of water are maintained at a steady flow in order to capture, various forms of insects or other aquatic species, in order for that beaver to sustain itself, that animal. And that that water, these pools of water, are maintained throughout the driest of seasons in order to, sustain its way of life, and to ensure that the water levels will basically be suitable until the next rainfall. Here in Canada, we only have a short summer. So as we like to say, we have about six months of spring, summer, fall, and then the other 6 months is basically winter. So in those 6 months where it's not below freezing temperatures, these animals are preparing and developing using this natural infrastructure in order to create a preservation of this body of water, this collection of water. And oftentimes we take a look, oftentimes we take for granted that we overlook animals, we overlook the ecological, the ecology that's actually existing right out in rural areas, and we forget that that knowledge is there. The Indigenous peoples that have been, harvesting, hunting, and gathering within these rural areas, they have this knowledge, and they can basically use that knowledge to bring to the table to work with engineers or policymakers, what have you, in order to how do we better sustain this resource? What is the biggest challenge that we're facing is getting, I guess, getting Western society to validate this knowledge that it is worthy, that in this climate change era that we need to do something different. We need to collaborate, and that collaboration, you have to have that open mindset. So that positive mindset allows for many people at the table to actually move forward with this knowledge exchange and not discounting something that may be totally foreign, but taking a look at how does this natural infrastructure can be incorporated into a sustainable city. How does that work? And basically, it's like saying here, you're taking natural soil, topsoil, the grasses, and putting it on top of roofs, right? Here in Canada, we use a lot of asphalt shingles, and it's all black. And we all know that the color black in the summertime retains a lot of heat, so which causes a little bit more localized weather phenomena. Changing the color of your rooftop from black to white can actually be very substantially for the building itself, but also for the minimizing of the localized weather phenomena. So when we take a look in nature, you don't have to go too far. That there's a lot of mosses, it's covering the base of trees and stuff like that, and it's done so in order to protect the moisture, protect its natural infrastructure, what it's actually trying to maintain, as well as the water levels. So when we take a look at what a First Nation community is doing, such as my own, we reside between bodies of water that were man-made. Go back 50 years ago, 60 years ago, before the water bodies were created, there was a natural stream that ran through the bottom valley of this area. And a lot of the First Nation communities within the valley knew that this was a very sustainable source that everybody could use. And, over time, that continued to exist until, unfortunately, fortunately, however you want to look at it, the development of agricultural started to increase within the area, which created a lot of pressure on this natural stream that was actually running through, and then eventually leading the different levels of government to pass policy, create policy, and to enforce policy to basically dam the water and to create these bodies of water, which basically was a destruction and encroachment of traditional territories. The thing that I look to now is how does the current governments of the different levels of government here in this province, how are they willing to change, or how are they willing to accept Indigenous involvement? So this inclusion of this traditional ecological knowledge that we bring to the table, and allowing business community leaders to sit at the same table and say, look, we're not against developments, we're not against business, but we have to do it in a different way. And a lot of our business leaders are intrigued about this because they want to hear and they want to see how it can be done in a different way. So if that means that the resources are going to be impacted or developed in such a way that could potentially cause some harm or destruction or encroachment to any of our Indigenous communities, then we need to make sure that the table of stakeholders are listening and are sitting there in order to understand, how do we ensure that we can do something that's going to minimize the potential impact, the negative impacts? How do we create an avenue that will allow for more positive impact to everybody sitting at the table, so that, again, Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge is basically at the table and to help steer or guide some of the decision making that surrounds or involves policy and policy development now and into the future. So again, there's a lot of it's a lot of new ideas and a lot of different individuals, different governments, business leaders they're interested, but at the same time, they need an avenue to get everybody to sit at the table. So again, it takes a lot of communication, a lot of patience, and a lot of willing to change in order to, understand, some of the issues behind these different practices that can actually be implemented. Thank you.
Ok. O que o Jason falava
Okay,
anteriormente no
what
início do
Jason
programa,
said in the
a
beginning of the
respeito de
program,
que nossas vivências,
saying
apesar de
that our
estarem em
experiences,
lugares
although we
geograficamente
are in
distantes,
distant
elas são muito
places from each
próximas,
other, we are
exatamente
very
o
close
que o
to each
Tim
other in the
coloca,
same
né?
time.
Nós,
This is
enquanto
what Tim
povos
said.
indígenas, a
We,
governança
as
indígena,
indigenous, the
ela é
indigenous
movida a
governance
partir
is
da
moved
sustentabilidade. E
by the
quando ele coloca
sustainability. And when he says,
sentar à mesa,
sit at the
convocar a
table,
comunidade a
bring them
sentar-se à
together to the
mesa, a
table,
gente
invite
não
the
está
community to the
comentando nada
discussion
mais,
table.
nada menos
We
do
are
que uma
just
governança
saying
comunitária,
that we
que é uma
need a
governança comum
community
aos
governance,
povos
a common
indígenas que tem
governance for the
como
indigenous
a
people
decisão coletiva
that
como ponto
should make
principal
the
da tomada de
collective
decisões a
decision
respeito
and
de tudo
make
que vai
decision
envolver
regarding
vida indígena. E
everything
a vida
that is going
indígena
to
não diz
involve the
respeito só
indigenous
àquela
life. It's
comunidade,
not only
mas a
about the
tudo que
one
a
community.
cerca,
It's
em
about
especial aquele
everything in its
contato de
surrounding
reciprocidade
and to
com a
have
natureza, né?
reciprocity with
Então, é
nature.
exatamente o que
So
o
it's
Tim traz
exactly what
na,
Tim
na
brings
fala, né?
us
Então, essa
in
prática de
his
governança, ela
speech,
precisa
this governance
é,
practice.
alcançar
It must
ouvidos
reach
comprometidos com uma escuta
ears
responsável.
committed to
É,
a
é o que ele colocava.
responsible
Aqui no
listening.
Brasil, nós
So here
estamos
in
às
Brazil,
vésperas
we are prior
da,
to
do, 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 do evento da COP30,
the COP30
que
event,
está causando assim impacto
and
muito
it's
grande nas
causing a
comunidades
big
indígenas
impact
daquele
in the
território,
indigenous
que não
communities in
deveria
that
acontecer. Quando
territory. This shouldn't
sentar-se à
happen.
mesa, como
When
disse
they
o
sit at
Tim,
the
deve
table
ser um sentar-se à
together
mesa
with the decision
comprometido. Porque o
makers,
que
they
está
must be
acontecendo
committed.
lá no Pará?
And what is happening at
Muitas
Pará state?
comunidades, muitas
For
pessoas de
many
baixa
communities,
renda, não só a
many
população
low-income
indígena,
people, not
estão
only
sendo
the indigenous
retirados de seus
people, they
locais
are
onde moram,
being
para dar
removed
espaço para que
from the place
aconteça
where
a
they live so
COP30.
that they can make room
Então,
to build
é um
structure
espaço
venues
de
for
discussão
COP30.
sobre o
So
futuro
it's a
sustentável do
space to
mundo,
discuss the sustainability of
está
the world,
mexendo de
and
maneira
they
negativa com
are
aquelas comunidades,
dealing
com
in a
comunidades
negative
tradicionais,
way
ribeirinhos,
with
quilombolas,
the
indígenas.
quilombolas,
Então, quando
indigenous,
a gente
traditional
propõe
people
como
there.
população
When we
indígena
propose as indigenous people
essas mesas de debate, de
these
discussões,
debate
de
tables,
discussão de
these
coletividade,
discussions,
é importante
collective
que os governos
discussion,
também
it's very important that the
entrem
governments
nesses espaços
get into
para
these
validar o que as
spaces,
populações
these
indígenas,
discussions to
as
validate what
populações
indigenous
tradicionais conhecem.
community say
Porque
and
quem
know,
mora lá, quem
because
vive,
those who live
quem
there,
maneja o rio,
who
quem maneja
manage
a
the
natureza,
river, the
que
nature,
conhece de
who knows
sustentabilidade,
about
nesses
sustainability.
momentos de decisões eles ficam
In
fora,
these
eles não têm, eles têm
decision-making moments,
visibilidade,
they are
mas eles não têm a
segregated. They
fala,
have the
eles não têm
visibility,
direito à
the
voz.
experience,
Então,
the knowledge,
outros
but they are not
destinos,
entitled to
eles
share their
preferem ser
voice, their
fontes
knowledge.
de conhecimentos
So
que
they
possam
have
estar
much wisdom. They could be
com um
sharing that.
projeto pronto
They
aí
could,
de
they,
sustentabilidade
they
a
can
muito
have
trabalhar,
sustainability
eles não são
projects,
ouvidos, né?
but
Então
they
é
are not
interessante que a gente
listened
também
to. It's
perceba
interesting
essas
to
jogadas
notice
de
this
políticas nacionais
these
ou
national political
internacionais
moves or
também, que
international
às vezes
moves
elas
as well.
trazem um emblema,
Sometimes
uma
they
bandeira de
they raise
sustentabilidade,
the
mas na verdade
sustainability
é
flag,
só uma
but
bandeira, não é de
actually
fato o
it's only a
objetivo
flag. It's not what they do for
dessas
real. It's not the main
situações
goal for
que
these
comprometem a
situations.
vida do
And these
planeta como um todo.
compromise the whole planet as
E
a whole.
Eu quero fazer só uma pergunta a mais
I'd like to
para
ask a
o
question.
Tim,
I'd like
se
to
ainda
ask
tiver
Tim a
tempo, ainda tem
question
até
if we
5
still have
minutos.
time.
Claro,
Do I have
Karina,
time?
pode ir
Yes,
em
Professor
frente.
Karina, you can go on.
Ok, então eu quero perguntar, Tim, a
I'd
você,
like to ask you, Tim.
eh, as práticas de governança
So the
das
governance
populações indígenas do
practice
Canadá.
for
Como é que o
Canadian
governo
Indigenous communities, how does the
ele vê
government
hoje, que,
see
como você disse, né, no
currently, as you
Canadá
said,
já,
in Canada,
percebe-se muito essa questão da mudança climática. Aqui
you
também,
notice the
só que há
climate
uma
change here
diferença
in Brazil as well, but there is a
eu
difference,
acredito que
I believe,
de conscientização
of
do efeito da mudança
awareness
climática no
of
Canadá
the
e aqui no
climate
Brasil.
change
Aqui a gente
effect
ainda
in
está
Canada and in Brazil.
engateando
In
para
Brazil, we
nos
are still
conscientizarmos
starting
e lá no
crawling.
Canadá, como é que
We
é
are raising awareness.
relação às
But
questões políticas? Como é que o
what can
governo
you tell
vê
me about the government,
essas
the
intervenções
political
às populações indígenas?
interventions? How do you see that in Canada?
So, yeah, definitely. We're seeing a noticeable trend in the different levels of government in various parts of Canada. We take a look at the West Coast here in Canada, and we take a look at what government is actually promoting, allowing Indigenous knowledge to be I guess, implemented and utilized within a lot of the engineering projects in British Columbia. Some of the latest examples that I can recall off the top of my head is the natural damming, or I guess the dams that are being created. They have implemented shelves, I guess water shelves that basically goes up along the side of the dam to allow the water to flow on the side. So then this way it doesn't impede the fish spawn, salmon spawn. So they're allowed to still go upstream using these various pools. Like as I explained, the beaver will create these pools. So it's the exact same concept on these man-made dam projects, and it basically allows it allows the engineering companies to proceed by creating these different types of additions to the existing dams, so that really what it does is it allows for that traditional ecological knowledge, sustainable practices to continue and not impede on the salmon runs. Salmon is a big industry in British Columbia, and sustainably done in such a way that allows for natural salmon to return back to their spawning grounds in the mountains and from the sea, Pacific Ocean. So when you take a look at different levels of government that are promoting this type of practice in various parts of the country here in Canada, you really need to see the impacts firsthand in order for other government agencies around the world, or other levels of government around the world, to actively foster and promote this type of inclusion of Indigenous knowledge into infrastructure projects, especially when sustainable cities, sustainable development is, it's whether you live in a city or you live outside the city, it's at some point going to be impacted down the road. So having that opportunity to be down in Brazil last year, very thankful. One of the things that I noticed in one of the communities was the big lake that we had the opportunity to swim in. Well, I didn't swim in; it was Mr. Jason was swimming in, and it was pretty cold. But when you take a look at a resource that big, that water, that pool, and it's servicing a major city like Curitiba, the sustainable effect would be similar, as creating these different levels of water platforms that lead into the city. So it still allows for the natural environment to thrive, and to allow that traditional ecological knowledge to continue, while at the same time drawing down on a resource or utilizing a resource in a more sustainable practice. And that efforts of the water leading into the city from outside of the city, it's it would be a very long-term project, but at the same time, it would be very sustainable, especially to allow for economic growth, that progression of the city, but at the same time respecting the Indigenous communities that are located around that pool of water to continue to develop their traditional knowledge and to preserve it in such a fashion that they're working side by side. It's the same thing that we see in Canada, but also I believe in the Western United States, the northwest part there, where Seattle is, which is just under Vancouver. It's the same thing that they are fully aware of, where this mountainous region is home to some of the best salmon fish, and you need to preserve those fisheries at all cost. So different levels of government here in Canada, when we take a look at Eastern Canada, they're going so far as allowing some of the communities, grassroots communities, to have a big part in the ongoing maintenance and operation of some of these projects that are being developed around these water resources. So again, it's how proactive your government can actually get involved in a lot of the infrastructure projects by allowing that Indigenous inclusion to happen within a lot of these engineering projects. And really, when you take a look at it, what's life going to be like for that area in the next 50 years? You want to sustain it, you want to maintain it in such a manner that allows for all stakeholders to collaborate equally in ensuring that this project or this resource is moving forward, even if it's a little bit slower, but it's still being pushed forward so that it doesn't hinder the resource itself. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Tim. Professor, lots of students in our chat on YouTube, they're saying that it's really interesting to understand how the situation is in Canada and how relatable it is to us here in Brazil. Although there are differences, there are also many similarities. Professora Karina, muitos alunos elogiando sua participação,
So
curiosos
many
sobre a sua atuação
students
profissional,
praising your
e dizendo que
participation,
gostariam
and
muito de
they are
ouvir a
saying
perspectiva
that
de um
they'd like
indígena
to
local, né, no
hear the
caso,
perspective
nós
of a
temos a sua
local
representação
indigenous. So
aqui, a
we
sua
have your
representatividade aqui no nosso evento.
representativeness in our
E nós temos
event,
uma
Professor
pergunta, né,
Karina.
de uma
And we
aluna no
have a
nosso
question
chat. Ela
from
diz
a student on our
justamente que
chat.
seria
She
muito
says,
importante
"Oh,
para
it would
poder
be
termos um
very
indígena
important
local para
to
entender um
have
pouco
a
como
local
está aqui.
indigenous person to understand what
Ela
things are
diz que
like
nós não
here in
estamos
Brazil."
sofrendo como
She
no
said that we are
Canadá, porque
not
temos
suffering
mais
as
recursos
people in
naturais.
Canada
Professora
because
Karina,
we
como
have
que
more
você vê a
natural
situação
resources.
quando comparada,
Professor
né, a
Karina,
situação
how do you see the
do tema
situation
que nós estamos tratando hoje,
of the topic that we
comparado
are
ao que o
addressing
professor Tim
today compared
relatou
to
sobre o
what
Canadá?
Professor
Qual é a sua
Tim
percepção
said
comparando a
about
nossa
Canada? How can you
realidade aqui no
compare
Brasil e
our
a
reality
realidade
in
relatada
Brazil
pelo professor
and
Tim
the
no Canadá com
reality in
relação a esse
Canada
tema aqui que nós estamos
reported by
discutindo no
Professor
nosso evento
Tim
de hoje?
regarding the topic we are addressing today?
A diferença pontual
So
que eu
the
percebo
specific
é essa
difference
tomada
that
de
I
consciência
notice
que
is this
é muito diferente
awareness
do
raising.
Canadá em
It's very
relação ao
different,
Brasil.
Canada from
Aqui,
Brazil.
o que me parece
So
é
it
que todo
seems to
mundo
me
já
that
está
everyone
desacreditado de uma outra
is,
possibilidade
is not
de
believing
vida.
that doesn't
E aí
believe
tem a
in
ideia de pegar a
another
palavra e
life
vamos chutar
possibility.
logo de uma vez.
So
É
people
essa a
think, oh,
impressão
it's
que eu
going to be
tenho
over.
enquanto
Let's do
população
it
indígena.
at once.
O meu
This is what I
povo
see. My
é do
people,
Mágua Cambeba. Na nossa
Magua Kambeba,
cosmovisão, na
in
nossa
our
cosmogênese,
vision,
o
in our
povo Mágua é um
cosmogenesis,
povo que nasce
so
nas
Magua
águas. Então, a
is
nossa
a
cosmovisão
people that
diz
starts
que foi
from
de
the
uma gota de
water.
água que surgiu a
We
primeira
say that it
Cambeba
was from
e a primeira
a
Cambeba, o
drop of
primeiro Mágua, o
water
primeiro
that
Cambeba.
came, the first people
Então, a água para nós é
from us.
fundamental. Ela
Water
é
for
base
us
de
is
tudo.
paramount. It's
E
the basis
quando a
of
gente
everything.
vai perceber, volta
And
a olhar para o
when we
Brasil,
turn our
nós
look to
percebemos que
Brazil,
hoje,
we noticed
38
that today
milhões de pessoas
38
não
million
têm acesso a
people
uma
don't
água de
have
qualidade.
access to
E a maior parte, por
uh,
incrível que
to
pareça,
drinking
dessas
water,
pessoas
high
que não têm
quality
uma água
water. And these
potável de
people that don't have
qualidade, elas
good
estão
quality drinking
na
water,
Amazônia,
these people,
que
they
é
live
onde
in
há o
Amazonia.
maior manancial
It's
de
where
água
we have
doce
more
do mundo. Então
water,
há uma
drinking water
contradição.
in the world. There is a
E
contradiction
isso
there.
aí vai afetar
And this
na vida das
will
comunidades,
affect
nos
the
territórios
lives
das
of
comunidades.
communities, the
O que nós
territory
vamos
of
observar que é
communities. What we are going
diferente
to observe
em
is
relação
that
ao
it
que o
is
professor Tim ele
different compared
coloca.
to what
Porque
Professor Tim
lá,
said, because
governo,
there in
quando fala
Canada,
governo, não é só
when you say
uma
government,
pessoa, são as
it's not
várias
only one
entidades que
person,
formam o governo
several
que
entities
estão
that compose the
querendo
government.
esse
Several
apoio,
people,
esse
they
conhecimento
want this
ancestral que vem das
knowledge,
populações
this
indígenas, enquanto
ancestor
aqui
knowledge from
ainda
indigenous
a
people.
população
And here in
indígena
Brazil,
briga para ser
indigenous
ouvida e quando
people,
ele
we
fala,
have to
ninguém quer
fight to
ouvir.
be
Então, essa
heard. And
diferença
when
ela é
we
muito
speak, nobody
gritante
wants to listen to
do
us.
Canadá
This
para o
difference
Brasil.
is really
Então, a
striking
gente ainda,
comparing
enquanto
Canada to
população
Brazil.
indígena,
We, as
nós tivemos
indigenous
ontem um
people,
encontro
yesterday we
com
had a
uma liderança
gathering with
indígena
an
e ela
indigenous
dizia,
leader, and
lembrando a
she
respeito
said
da questão do
she
Rio
was
Grande
talking about
do Sul, que
Rio
aconteceu
Grande
na
do Sul
última
state,
enchente
what the
aqui
floods that happened in
no
Rio
Brasil,
Grande do
nessa
Sul
parte aqui
state. It
da
was
região
terrible
sul,
in the south of
onde
Brazil,
várias
and
comunidades indígenas
several
que
indigenous
são aquelas que
communities.
cuidam dos
They are
territórios,
those
que
who take
cuidam da
care of the
floresta, dos
territories, the
mananciais de água,
forests, the water,
quando elas ficaram
place,
por
and
conta das enchentes,
because of the
com
floods,
dificuldade de acesso,
they
não tinham
struggled
barco para se
with
locomover de lá para sair,
accessing
porque o local
places they
estava
didn't have a
alagado.
boat because and
Não
their
tinha
places
telefone
were
nem internet,
flooded.
porque
They
a
didn't have
internet ela não
internet,
chega
telephone because
nessas
internet
localidades.
doesn't
E
get
ele
to
ia fazendo
these
um
localities.
contraponto.
And then
Inclusive, foi uma manchete
he,
bem pequena
it
que
was
os
a
indígenas
short
cidadãos estavam
headline
pedindo
saying that
socorro e fomos nós,
indigenous
indígenas
Guarani
mesmo, que colocamos.
were
A
asking for
mídia, a
help.
grande mídia,
And
não
we
divulgou muita
published
coisa.
it, but the
E ele
media
fazia o
didn't announce,
contraponto em
advertise it.
relação ao
And
cavalo
he was
caramelo, ao
talking
cavalo
about the
lá,
caramel
que foi
horse
manchete no Brasil
that
e foi
was
para
a
fora, que o
headline throughout Brazil
cavalo
and
ele
international.
vale
A horse is
ele tem
worth
maior visibilidade que
more
as
or had
populações
more
indígenas
visibility
que
than the
poderiam estar,
indigenous community
inclusive,
that could
trabalhando
be
para que essa situação
working
de
in
enchente
order to
não viesse a
help,
acontecer,
in
porque a
order
gente
to
sabe que tudo
prevent this
isso
flood
é
situation from
resultado da
happening. We
catástrofe
know it
ambiental
is
que o
a climate
Brasil
change
vem
catastrophe,
enfrentando
and
e ele
Brazil
mesmo
has
vem
been
cavando
facing
esse
it,
caminho.
and Brazil has been paving this terrible way.
Muito obrigada, professora Karina. Gostaria de saber
Thank you,
se você tem mais
Professor
alguma
Karina.
pergunta
I
para o
was
professor
wondering
Tim.
if
Nós
you
temos um
have any
tempinho
question.
ainda.
We still have some time.
Ok. Eu quero só fazer um comentário a
So I'd
respeito
like to make a comment
da, da água,
about
que
water
nós
resources.
verificamos aqui cada vez mais, principalmente
We
na
have
região da Amazônia,
seen
onde tem os
increasingly,
Yanomami,
mainly
a
in
grande quantidade
Amazonia region,
de
where
rios que estão
Yanomamis are,
sendo
the
poluídos
number
e que
of
foram
rivers
poluídos há
that
um
are
tempo mais
contaminated,
do que agora,
polluted,
em relação à
and this
questão
has
dos
been happening
garimpos, em relação
because
a
of
outras
mining
questões de exploração.
and some other
E
exploitation
outros
issues,
países eles
and
já
some other
chegaram
countries
a
uh,
tornar
um,
o rio, por exemplo,
they
o
made
rio
some
Maranhão, no
rivers
Peru,
there. Maranu River in Peru,
ano
for example.
2021, ele se
In
tornou um sujeito de
2021, it
direito.
became
Olha que
a
interessante.
subject
A
of
população
right.
indígena do
The
povo
indigenous
Cucama,
population from
um grupo de
Kukama
mulheres
people,
entrou
a
com a
group of
justiça
women, they
para que
filed
ali se
a
tornasse um
lawsuit to
sujeito de
make
direito.
the
Então, foi uma
river
batalha
to become
judicial
a
que
subject, an
teve o
individual.
primeiro
It was a
caso
legal
no
dispute.
Equador.
It was
E
we had
esse é
the
o
first
segundo caso
case
onde
in
as
Ecuador,
comunidades
and this is the
indígenas, no
second
caso, as
case that the
mulheres indígenas
indigenous
do povo
community,
Cucama, eles
indigenous women
conseguiram,
from
por
Kukama
medida
people
judicial,
tribe,
que o rio tivesse
legally,
direito,
they
direito de existir,
they made the
direito
river
de
to be
viver e
entitled
direito de não
to
ser, de
live,
ser
exist,
protegido,
and
né?
be
Então essa
protected.
é uma tendência
This
que as
is a
populações indígenas
trend
estão
that the
chegando
indigenous
a fazer para que, de
communities they
fato,
are doing
crie
so that
essa política, essa
indeed
filosofia
they can create this
do
philosophy, this
ecocentrismo,
policy
as questões
in
do
which
ecossistema,
the
que são o
ecosystem
equilíbrio das
issues,
vidas, elas sejam de
uh,
fato o centro das
they
discussões
must
e
be
das
the key
políticas
of
públicas
discussions
no
and
mundo todo.
public
Então,
policies
era
throughout
essa
the world. They
a
must see
informação que eu
that this is the
queria compartilhar com
information
vocês,
I'd like to share with
porque
you,
eu acredito que daqui a
because I
pouco
believe
o
that
Brasil também
shortly
vai entrar nessa
Brazil will
questão
get
de
into
tornar-se guardião, as
this, to
populações
become the
indígenas como
guardians,
guardião da
to
água
make
ou de
indigenous
outros
people as guardians
meios que a
of
gente chama
water
de
and other
parentes não
other
urgentes, não
resources,
humanos, que são os rios,
for
que
example,
são a
rivers,
natureza, a floresta,
nature,
porque
forests,
infelizmente nós
because
estamos engatinhando
unfortunately
como
we are
crianças em
still in
relação
the
à
inception
questão de
moment,
preservação
crawling as
ambiental.
babies in the
Nós, enquanto
environmental
indígenas, nós temos
preservation. We as indigenous
essa filosofia de que
people, we
nós
have this
pertencemos à
philosophy that
natureza
we
e
belong to
não a
nature
natureza
and
pertence a gente.
not
Que
nature belong
então
to
é
us.
uma,
We
é uma
think like
visão
that. This
diferente
is a different
das outras
point of view
populações não
compared
indígenas.
to
E, inclusive, nós
non-indigenous
temos assim,
population.
muita semelhança
And
com a população
we have
quilombola,
many
de cuidar
similarities
da
to
terra, de
Quilombola
cuidar dos
people
recursos.
to take
E
care
para
of
nós
land,
indígenas,
resources, and
a
for us indigenous people,
natureza como um todo, ela não é
nature as a
recurso,
whole is not
porque
a
essa palavra
resource,
recurso,
because this word
ela vem da
resource comes
construção
from
de
the
uma política onde
construction
o
of
tudo é
a
recurso, tudo
policy
possa
that
ser
everything
algo.
is
Então, para nós, ela
profit,
não é
everything is
recurso,
resource.
ela
For us,
é,
it's
na
not a
verdade,
resource.
aquela que
It
nos dá
is
o que a gente
the thing
precisa.
that gives
E
us
quando o
what we
Tim
need.
falava
And when Tim
dessa
said,
ideia de
talked
que a
about this
população indígena
idea
só
that
tira o que é
the indigenous
necessário,
population only take
exatamente
what
é a
they
partir
need.
dessa
It's
filosofia que
based on
nós
this
entendemos que o
philosophy that
equilíbrio
we
acontece.
understand that
E nós
the
aqui no Brasil
balance happens.
precisamos nos
And we in
imbuir dessa
Brazil, we must
filosofia
be embedded in
muito,
this philosophy,
porque cada dia mais nós
because
vemos
increasing
no mapa, nós não
we see
contamos mais
on the map,
os
we don't
focos de
count
incêndio, os focos
the fire
vermelhos
spots,
que
the red
marcam
spots
a
showing
ausência de floresta. Nós
the
contamos os
absence of
espaços
forest.
verdes que estão
We
ficando cada
count
vez
the green
menores.
spaces that are becoming smaller and smaller.
Muito obrigada, professora Karina.
E eu queria saber
Thank
agora,
you.
agora
So
do
I
Tim,
was,
a
I'd like to
respeito
ask
do que eu
Tim
falei.
about
Que
what I've
conselho
just
você,
said.
enquanto
What kind of advice you could
professor que
give us
trabalha com
as a
essa
professor
questão
who work with this
de valorização
topic
da
about
sustentabilidade,
valuing
que já tem um
sustainability,
caminho bem mais
and
adiantado em relação
you are more
àquilo que eu
advanced than
falava aqui em
us
relação às
related to
vivências
what
das
I'm saying
populações indígenas no Brasil.
about the Brazilian
Que
indigenous
caminhos você
people and experiences.
aponta para
What
nós,
pathways,
enquanto
what
população
North
indígena,
Star
para
could
nós, enquanto
you
não indígenas,
advise
mas
us
brasileiros,
for us
para
as
também
Brazilians, indigenous, non-indigenous,
somar com as
so that
populações
we
indígenas
can
nessa luta
collaborate
da
with indigenous
sustentabilidade?
people in this fight for sustainability?
Great, thank you for the question. Definitely, there is a lot that the Brazilian indigenous communities can look forward to, now into the future, how to participate and to push for a seat at the table and in a very respectful manner. Here in Canada, a lot of our nations, we've actually had requested in writing to sit at the tables, to be at those meetings where policies are being made. And fortunately for us here in Canada, we had federal policy that allowed us to basically be invited late to the meeting, but we still came to the meetings. And when I take a look at what I seen when I was down in Brazil, you have a very large collective voice of Indigenous peoples, a very large collective knowledge, pool of knowledge of this traditional ecological knowledge in that beautiful country you have in the Southern Hemisphere. You have the opportunities to, work with those engineering firms to, patent some of your ideas so that they're protected in every which way, shape, or form, so that it shows that the traditional ecological knowledge is worthy to a lot of the protection of your resources. It allows you to sit at the tables or request seats at the tables with the different levels of government, and to show that Indigenous knowledge needs to be incorporated into the policy decisions, in order to protect resources for not only for the Indigenous communities, but for all the individuals and all the Brazilians that are there. And, I would really, I would also recommend that any of the students, students, to look forward at developing those cross-university partnerships in other countries around the world. There is, I had a chance to, when I was down in Phoenix, Arizona, United States, in January, to listen to Indigenous leaders across Canada and some from the United States, to talk about how, collectively here in Canada and the United States, we have over close to 1,200 communities collectively that can be utilized as a resource to, what would work, how, putting it out there. And it was actually the lead speaker, the moderator, was actually from a very prestigious university in the United States, who presented an idea that one of the main companies, a very space exploration company in the United States, utilized this network. They send it out to groups of people to get feedback. So it would be the same thing for the Indigenous Brazilian communities, to band together to utilize their collective knowledge, whichever part of the country that they're from. You have an idea, send it out to the communities and get their input, and then bring it back, and then using that knowledge to help push the ideas that of Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge at all levels of government and all areas of business. Thank you.
Excelente, professora Karina. Thank you, Professor Tim.
Excellent.
Passo a palavra ao professor Rogério
So
agora.
now,
Ele tem algumas
Professor
perguntas para o
Rogério, he
professor
has
Tim.
some
Professor, fique à
questions to
vontade.
ask Professor Tim. Professor Rogério, please.
Primeiramente, obrigado.
Hello. Thank you, Professor Tim, Professor Karina, for the beautiful explanation you delivered. I have some points I'd like to ask, but feel free to answer them. One question that I have is how the educational system can act in all of that. So here in Brazil, we have a law that is very recent, 11,645, that made it mandatory in the to have a basic education for Indigenous people. In Canada, I think there is a similar movement, or more mature than ours, regarding education for Indigenous people. So, Professor Karina and Tim, what is the importance of this kind of initiative to elevate the public collective commitment to the environment from the Indigenous people? This would be something for you to talk about. And another topic related, focused on, directed to Professor Tim, a concept that is very strong in sociology, the economical decreasing, opposite to the sustainability idea, the perspective that the sustainability idea is not coping with it, and then there is this new idea that suggests an economical decreasing, so that we can have the preservation of the environment. I'd like you just to talk about it, what you think about it. I have more questions. Only these two topics I'd like you to address, okay? You can talk about what made sense to you, and congratulations, we are having a brilliant night with view.
Posso começar falando da Lei
I can start
11.645 de
talking about
2008.
the law,
É uma lei
83
que
2008.
institui
It
o
is a
ensino,
law
né,
that
de cultura
talks about
indígena
indigenous culture
de
teaching
modo geral no ensino, na educação
at
básica.
basic
E
education
eu
school
venho,
for
inclusive, eu venho
non-indigenous
discutindo
students.
muito em
And I've
relação a
been
essa lei,
discussing
porque
this
se
law
nós estivermos atentos a esses
because
últimos 2 anos,
in the last 2
como
years,
aumentou o número de cursos
we could
de
see an increase in the number
pós-graduação a
of
respeito dessa lei,
courses about this law.
porque
It-
já passaram-se muitos anos
because many
e
years went
pouca coisa
by
se viu a
and
respeito
very
dela.
little was done
Mas eu acredito que
using this law.
a lei ela só vai,
But
de
I
fato, ser
believe that
efetivada
this
quando
law will be
tiver
enacted for real,
esse letramento crítico a
implemented,
respeito da lei.
when we have this
E o que é um
critical
letramento
education
crítico?
about
É um
the
letramento
law.
pedagógico, de
It's
fato.
a
Como é que nós vamos,
pedagogical
se eu não,
thing.
se eu não sou indígena, como é que
If
eu
I'm
vou
not indigenous,
tentar? Eu sou
how
professor não indígena,
can I
supondo,
try? I'm a
fazer
non-indigenous
com que essa
professor.
lei
How
se
can I make
estabeleça
this
de
law
cima para
established
baixo,
top
né? Então eu
down,
preciso
implemented
entender
top
do
down?
que
First,
trata.
I
A
must
lei ela trata
understand
das
what is
cosmologias,
the
ela
law
trata da
about.
cultura, das
It's about
culturas
culture,
indígenas, que não é apenas
cosmology,
uma.
indigenous
Então
culture.
eu
It's
preciso
not a
compreender esse
single one. There
universo
are
indígena.
many. First, I need to
Eu sempre
understand
costumo
this
dizer,
indigenous universe.
conhecer
I always
para
say
reconhecer. Então eu só
we
vou
must
reconhecer
know to
depois que eu conhecer.
recognize.
Porque
I'm
se eu
going
não
to
conhecer a
recognize
cultura
something
indígena, não
only
adianta eu
after
levar
knowing indigenous
na
culture.
semana
If
das
I don't know
populações
indigenous
indígenas um grupo
culture, I cannot
que eu
recognize it.
trago os
So
indígenas da
I
comunidade
bring
deles e que eles dançam,
indigenous
e
group
se eu
to
não
dance to
compreender a
non-indigenous
a
people. If I don't
batida
understand
do pé do
how
indígena na
they stamp
terra, o
their
que
feet on the
significa, vai
land,
ser
what it
apenas uma
means,
apresentação e
it will
nada
be
mais.
only
Nada
a
resultou.
presentation. I have to
Nada
give deeper
prosperou dentro daquela
information.
pessoa, na concepção daquela pessoa, para
It
ela
would
vivenciar
be only a simple
essa
presentation,
questão da
so we
cultura
must go
indígena.
deeper
Uma
to make
outra
people
coisa
experience
é a
indigenous culture.
ambiência das escolas.
Another
Enquanto
thing
não
is the
houver ambiência
ambience in
escolar,
school. Um,
essa lei vai ser
as we don't
capenga.
have
E o que é
this
uma
in
ambiência
school,
escolar?
this
É fazer com
law
que
will
todas
not
as
be
culturas
implemented
elas
fully.
sejam vistas
So we
na
must
própria escola.
make
Na
all the
escola em
cultures
que
to be
você
seen
estudou,
at
ou na
schools
escola do seu
where you
filho, como
studied,
que você
in your
observa o
children's
ambiente
school.
escolar?
How do
Se
you
tem
observe
quilombola, ele se enxerga
the
naquela
school
escola?
environment?
Se tem um
Can you see a
indígena, ele
quilombola and
consegue se
indigenous
enxergar e se
persons
sentir
there?
pertencido
Can
àquele
they feel
local?
that they
Se
belong
não,
to that
não
place?
está
If
valendo a
not,
lei ainda.
the
A gente
law
precisa
is not
caminhar por esses
implemented
meandros
yet.
e
We
entender de fato a
must
lei. E
understand
para
the
entender
law
de fato a
for
lei, aí eu
real.
bato na
And to
tecla que
understand
é
it for
preciso
real, I
mais
harp on it.
professores
We
indígenas
need
trabalhando
more
nessa lei,
indigenous
porque só de
people
fato
working on this
assim
law
a gente vai
because
saber
only like that
falar da dor que o
we'll be
indígena
able
sente,
to
a gente vai
talk
saber
about the
falar das
pain
verdades que o
that
indígena quer
indigenous
falar e nem
people
sempre
feel
tem
and
essas
the truth
possibilidades.
that indigenous
Mas
people
também
experience.
eu vou colocar a situação que a gente,
But
enquanto população indígena, coloca. A gente não pode soltar a mão de
we
ninguém.
cannot
Se
let
tem
go of the
um
hand
não
of anyone.
indígena
If
que
there
ele
is a
quer
non-indigenous
somar,
person that
e a
wants
gente
to
também, como população
add,
indígena, a gente
and
empodera
we
aquela
as
pessoa quando a gente
indigenous
sabe que
population,
ela
we
é
empower that people when we know
politicamente
that they are
de
politically
acordo com as nossas lutas, com as
correct and
nossas
according
vivências. Quando a
to
gente fala politicamente, no
our
sentido mais amplo e
strive.
mais
So
puro
when I say
possível,
politically,
para que
is when the
também
people
esteja
have
com a
the same
gente
goals
nessa
that we
luta de
do,
fazer
so that
essa
they
lei
join
ser
us to
efetivada em
make
todos
this
os
law to
aspectos,
be
porque
implemented,
não
set
é só na
forth
escola.
in
Por
all
que que
aspects, not
pede-se na
only at
escola? Porque a
school.
escola é um local
We ask
onde
about school because it is a
as
place
sociedades elas
where
têm uma
all
partezinha
societies are
dentro da
there
escola. Então, a
together.
partir da
They
escola,
have
eu posso
a
levar
part
para a
there.
macro
And from the
sociedade.
school,
E
I can
aí,
take
a
it
gente
to
vai
the
construir
macro
o que o Krenak
society.
sempre
And
propõe
then we
nos
are going to
discursos dele,
build
que
what
é
Krenak proposes,
a filosofia, que
which
é
is
a
the
gente se
philosophy
preparar para uma
to
sociedade da
prepare
convivência.
for
É
a
isso que a Lei
society that live together. Is
11.645
a
diz,
law
que as sociedades viventes convivem
11,645 for diverse society to live well together.
Okay, Professor Tim, if you would like to add any of your thoughts, you're welcome.
Great, thank you. Definitely, there's a lot of opportunity in that area. What Professor Karina was just mentioning. Here in Canada, we're a little bit more mature in terms of the policies that the government actually initiated to allow the Indigenous inclusion in a lot of the education, primary, secondary, and post-secondary education systems here right across Canada. And I find it very interesting because the inclusion of Indigenous participation as part of the curriculum delivery within the various levels of our education systems allow for a lot of the newcomers into Canada, as well as the existing Canadians, to really get an understanding of, they hear about Indigenous people and Indigenous people, their rights and claims and all that stuff. But now you're really hearing, or you're really seeing the transformation, because they didn't understand, what it was all about. So, if you can actively promote that within your own country to allow Indigenous participation through education delivery at all different levels of the education system, then you begin to build that friendship, build those alliances, and the future possibilities, which is really good. What it has done, to build on the second question, for economic participation within the economy here in Canada. A lot of our First Nation communities, they're not business adverse or risk adverse, or I guess you would say. They just want to ensure that a lot of these developments, these projects that are happening, are done in such a manner that allows the communities to have a say, or even sitting at the table or participating as a partner in that development project. One of the things that we've been pushing for here in Canada that I'm starting to see come into fruition is the upfront remediation reclamation process to be negotiated upfront for any development project. So you take a look at a greenfield mine here in Canada can run anywhere between 50 to 100 years. The participating company that's initiating this is, basically must be able to put aside funds within this remediation reclamation project up front, so that it allows the First Nation communities down the road that when that mining project is completed, that they have the funds available to put the land back to as near close as the original state. And there's a lot of planning upfront that is required to understand, what the topography of the land was before the project started to move forward. What type of resources were impacted, what type of was the water impacted. So a lot of this, it can be done by a lot of the mining companies, any company that's out there, to put aside this funds available for the Indigenous communities who are going to be there. Let's put it this way. Once that project is gone and done, the First Nation communities or Indigenous communities are going to still be living in that area. So why not create this remediation reclamation fund to allow the Indigenous communities to try and put back the land to its original state? And that may be quite a ways down the way, but as what it allows for is that inclusion of Indigenous participation in some of these projects. So the infrastructure or the development of some of these resources can proceed, but at the same time, they're taking responsibility that you're encroaching on traditional territories from these Indigenous people. And that's the recognition, the fundamental human recognition that a lot of these businesses, they often overlook, especially when it comes to the history of Indigenous people in various countries, right? So it almost seems that it's decolonializing a lot of that mindset in order for developments to move forward, by including Indigenous groups within that project or group of projects, however you might want to look at it. maintaining that resource or managing that resource from their perspective in some way, shape, or form, so that it allows for the Indigenous people to build that capacity over time in order to return the land to its near original state. Again, remediation, reclamation, negotiated up front is fundamental, and we're starting to see that here in Canada. So, thank you.
Muito obrigada, professor. Nós estamos nos aproximando do final do nosso evento.
Thank you, Professor. We are getting to the end of the event. We are going to have a cultural moment. And now over to Professor Florinda to start this moment with us. Welcome, Professor Florinda.
Olá a todos e a todas.
Hello, everyone. What a great joy to present another cultural moment at Uninter. I'm Flor Pimentel. I'm a professor at the music course. So Uninter wants to shorten distances, and then the music talent is an evidence of that. So we have participants from abroad, from all over Brazil. This song came from Austria, Vienna. It's a progressive rock composed by an Uninter student in computer engineering. He was a finalist last year, Christopher Terry.
Muito legal. E olha só, tem
It's
convite
really
para
cool.
você. Se você gosta
So I
de
have an
compor
invitation. If you
canções,
like
nós teremos
composing
o
songs
primeiro
or
festival de
music,
composição
we
de
have the
canções no nosso
first
quarto tamo, que já estamos com as
music
inscrições abertas.
composing
Vou também
contest.
colocar o
Sign
chat,
up for
o link no
it.
chat para
So we
vocês.
are going
E se
to
você
paste the
gosta de
link
compor
to the
canções, não perca
chat.
essa
If
oportunidade,
you
tá bom?
are a composer
Tchau,
like
tchau. Amanhã eu
composing,
volto com
don't
mais um
miss this
momento cultural.
opportunity. Tomorrow we have another cultural moment.
Muito obrigada, professora Florinda.
Thank
Excelente
you,
trabalho
Professor
nesse
Florinda.
nosso
Amazing
momento cultural.
music in this
Bem,
cultural
nós
moment.
chegamos ao momento final, né,
Well, we
do
got to the
evento. Nós
end
gostaríamos de
of our
agradecer a
event.
todos
We
os
would like to
participantes
thank
desse
all the
evento.
participants of this
Primeiramente, a nossa
event.
audiência,
First
por
of
esse
all,
evento
our
tão
audience that made
tão
this
colaborativo pelo
event
chat do YouTube. O
so
vice-presidente do Global
collaborative. The
Hub, Jason
vice
Diet, o
president,
professor Rogério aqui
Jason
conosco,
Diet, Professor
trabalhando aqui
Rogério,
também na
here
mediação
with us,
do
working
nosso
in the
programa.
mediation
Professora
of our
Karina da
program.
Costa Santos,
Professor
excelente
Karina
participação,
Santos'
com
excellent
excelentes colocações que
participation with
complementaram as
great
colocações do
opinions
professor
that
Tim, e a gente
added
gostaria
to
de
what
agradecer
Professor
especialmente
Tim
ao
said, and
professor
the
Tim
special
Isnana,
thanks to
porque
Professor
aceita o
Tim
nosso convite
Isnana
e
for having
gentilmente está
accepted
aqui com
our
a gente,
invitation
né,
and
contribuindo para o
kindly
nosso
participated
entendimento
with
desse
us,
tema tão
contributing
importante,
to
que é o
our
tema
understanding
tratado
of this topic that
nesse
is so
nosso evento do
important
Global Hub.
and
Nós
in our
desejamos a todos
global
uma
hub.
boa noite e nós nos
Wish
despedimos,
you
né, por
all
aqui,
good night.
desse
Thank
evento
you.
tão rico para a nossa
This event
formação.
was so
Muito
enriching
obrigada.
for our information. Thank you very